I guess in the spirit of we've this whole week we've been doing episodes because it's Halloween week. So there's a lot going on this week with that regard with our show anyway. So this is the third episode within the week. So Anik, I think, is calling it Hallow Week. Anyway, it's our trade week of Halloween episode. So this episode, we thought we'd reach out to, of course, one of our attorney friends and see what they can come up with that have a story that might scare the living daylights out of you, in the sense that, not literally, of course, but, you know, figuratively speaking, it will scare you if you ever find yourself in this kind of situation. So this is yet another Halloween episode. And again, in the tradition of our Simply Trade Crimes series, we thought we would just throw it in that category. We did reach out, and we were fortunate that we now have a new guest that we haven't had here before, but an old friend of the podcast through associations and all that. But thank you very much. We have Josh Rodman of Schulz Trade Law joining us here. Again, he's a first timer, but welcome, Josh, and
thank you so
forward
much,
to this conversation. Sure.
And Andy.
Yeah, you bet. It's like, well, we love, it's like Michelle Schultz and her whole team are just great folks. And, but your background too is you've had, as we were talking off camera here, that, you've worked for a couple of great companies and whatnot.
Yes. I started my career at Lockheed Martin, and I've worked at a few different law firms now, but Michelle is just the best. She's awesome. But I've had great fortune to work at great law firms, but certainly starting my career at Lockheed Martin got me into this world of export controls, sanctions, and related matters.
Well, we're going to get into a thing. Lalo, do you want to open this up, or do you want me to?
Yeah. So we when I reached out, I just asked, so what kind of scary stories, and again, not necessarily scary like I'm frightened or anything, but just kind of like stories that we want to highlight. And Josh came up with a couple of examples, of course, having to do with his background with exporting export controls, and more specifically with military in this case. But there's some really good examples here as to what to watch out for and what to be able to make sure that, like you said, Andy, crossing your T's and dotting your I's, make sure that you are going to, do what you need to. Even sometimes when you think you're doing it, things just turn around on you and they just don't happen that way, and just what you need to do and how you can recover from that. And Josh has a couple of great examples here for us. So, Josh, do you want to get started with the first story that you were talking about?
Absolutely. Lalo, I think that's, a great segue into this. Even when, we work with clients all the time that are, or we only work with clients of this nature that are trying to do things the right way and make mistakes. And this is really the first story I want to talk about. This is a client that's in the ballistic personal protective equipment space. And this client won a contract with Special Operations Command to supply ballistic protective helmets for Special Operations Forces, U.S. Special Operations Forces operating in a few different countries. And when the client was preparing to export these helmets, the client secured export licenses for the helmets, of course. These helmets were tactical battle helmets with NIJ level 3 protection. This client, when they secured the export licenses, secured them using ECCN 0A979. When this was all started up, we were tipped off to these issues by the client having outbound detentions of the helmets. So when we were reviewing for possible compliance issues, that's one of the first things we saw. These battle helmets are properly classified at ECCN 1A613.C. So to make a long story short, the client had been exporting on several occasions in fulfillment of these contracts, but not complete fulfillment yet, the helmets under export license from Commerce, but using the wrong ECCN. So the export license that was secured had ECCN 0A979 for the helmets instead of 1A613.C, with the proper classification being a 600 series ECCN that likely would have been subject to much higher scrutiny and review. Ultimately, the new licenses were granted as part of our VSD process, but because of that mistake, even though the client secured export licenses, they had to do a VSD especially given the time crunch of detentions, which typically indicate that the government is likely to initiate an investigation or can very easily initiate an investigation. And in order to get the protection of a VSD, including 50% mitigation on civil penalties, that needs to be filed before the government initiates an investigation. And I just want to make one point, that when you submit a license, the government, the Department of Commerce and the Department of State will not diligence your classification unless it's a marked error. And even in that case, they wouldn't necessarily diligence your classification. They may RWA or return the license without action. But in this case, Commerce papered over the ECCN designation chosen by the client because they didn't have a sample of the helmet in front of them, right? And issued the license.
Okay, so before we go back, let's go back, and because you're using a lot of acronyms. So for our audience,
let's clarify some of those acronyms.
Yes.
My apologies.
That's what we're here for. It is all right. So the ECCN, that's when you're basically coming up with a classification and filing and sending a transmission to the government, basically to say this is what I am exporting.
Yes,
an ECCN. Yeah, well, I was going to say whether it requires a license or not. So, and go ahead, you were going to define that?
Yeah. An ECCN is an export control classification number. And for the folks listening, everything that's exported from the United States, whether physically sent abroad or transferred to a foreign national in the United States in terms of technology, every export requires an ECCN for the item that's being exported. Even if it's food or clothing, which is controlled at ECCN EAR 99, which doesn't require licenses and can be exported to most destinations other than embargoed countries without a license. But everything needs an ECCN, and the designated ECCN kicks off all the related export compliance requirements for that item. So if you do not accurately determine the ECCN for an item, there's no possible way to determine which countries require a license to export that item to, which potential list-based license exceptions are available for that item, et cetera. So everything really flows in export compliance from the export classification, whether that's under the ITAR, which is the first order of review, or in the case of the example we're talking about, under commerce rules for the export administration regulations.
All right. And so in looking at what to simplify what we've got there, because keep in mind, I'm dumb as a box of rocks, so I got to keep it simple, right? So with this is that you basically had a client that wound up transmitting classification A, which was incorrect. It should have been classification B. And with that second classification, which was the accurate one or the correct one, had a lot more, we say, scrutiny, a lot more regulations with it, a lot more things that you should have been aware of. So in the end, when you're talking about a VSD, that's a voluntary self-disclosure, correct?
That's correct. Yes, a VSD is a voluntary self-disclosure.
So I was just going to say, so in the midst of this, they somehow found out they had an error. They looked at it, went through that. You guys were involved, obviously, in doing a voluntary self-disclosure to the government. And basically, that's when you're like, okay, I'm letting you know we found a problem. Here's how big it is. Here's the details of it.
That's exactly right. Clients come to a point of deciding whether to file a voluntary self-disclosure in different ways. Unfortunately, like this client, it's sometimes forced upon them. In this case, what happened, as I mentioned, was one of the outbound shipment of helmets was detained by customs outbound before it went to Africa on behalf of Commerce, so that Commerce could inspect and confirm classification. And as soon as the client alerted us to the outbound detention, we had to quickly determine, without finding out from the government, why the detention took place. And so reviewing the documentation and related tech specs for the helmet, we quickly realized that at least the export classification was incorrect, right? And because there had been several exports pursuant to these export licenses, pursuant to this export license, pursuant to the government contract I mentioned, we had to quickly get a VSD in because there was a pattern already of violation. And the specific compliance point, even though I used a lot of acronyms that I want everyone to take away from this, is when you're doing everything right, like you and Lalo said at the beginning, including obtaining export licenses for your exports, obtaining an export license also is not enough. The export license has to be correct. And the most important point in an export license, well, I guess you can't say the most important point because whole export license application is critically important. It has to be correct and accurate. But the ECCN for the item being exported has to be accurate because the government, like I said, is not going to independently diligence the ECCN unless it's so outlandish on its face that the government is confused by it. In this case, the client was exporting helmets. The initial classification they used was for helmets, just the wrong type of helmets, right? And the government's not going to dig in and parse that detail and say, this license application looks wrong. I think you entered the wrong ECCN. The government's not going to do that. That's on the exporter. And even where you've secured an export license, if the ECCN is wrong, your exports pursuant to that license are violations, as they were in this case. So the client was actually lucky here that there was an outbound detention and the client was sort of hipped off to the violation before the government initiated a formal investigation. So they were able to file this VSD and actually get off scot-free with a warning letter, no civil penalties. These were really good facts, right? Because the client was trying to do things the right way. This was pursuant to a government contract, trying to get helmets to our troops, right, to provide diplomatic protection, I believe was the case in this government contract. So this wasn't a case where the client was trying to pull a sort of cover over on the government in terms of getting stuff out, right? They put this stuff in front of the government initially. It was just under the slightly wrong classification, right? And like I said, as part of the VSD process, the client had to go back and obtain proper export licenses using the correct classification for the remaining shipments, which the government did grant. And that's sort of the ultimate indication that the government wanted this stuff to go. And had the client done it the right way initially, of course, it would have been granted as well, considering it was granted under the VSD circumstances. But I must say, I think this was the first time in my career that I've seen a client apply for an export license using the wrong ECCN and actually export licenses that were 600 series goods, 600 series goods being items that have a 6 for the third digit of the ECCN. Those items are subject to a higher level of control and scrutiny, as you said, Andy. So this was a real learning case that I wanted to bring to your listeners because it was the first time I had seen it in my practice, even though I knew it was theoretically possible and something we always watched for in terms of license applications that we were involved in, making sure that the ECCN was accurate. But this is the
Josh,
first time I've seen it.
let me ask you a question. The company involved, was this somebody that had experience exporting this, or were they expanding out internationally? You know, they normally would pretty much focused on a domestic market, and now they're going international.
Great question. The company's focus was certainly on domestic PPE sales of ballistic protective vests to police departments around the country, but they always had an ongoing minority percentage of their business devoted to exports. And that was certainly a contributing factor here, that exports generally and export compliance specifically was not the main focus of their business, given the vast majority of their business was domestic sales, where of course none of this was at issue.
Well, and the purpose of that is, folks, with the trade deals that are being negotiated and all that, there's great opportunity to look beyond the U.S. domestic market, is look at expanding, your markets internationally. But you also need to get the appropriate expertise to either bring it in-house or, get your consultants or experts and hire them to look over some things and help you along the way. And that's definitely an action you want to take, because the other side of this is potentially was that it was the fines and penalties on that could have been astronomical.
Yes.
And it's just fortunate, I guess, that they had a government contract. And so it was two different parts of the government. One was issuing the contract. The other one was ensuring, you cross the T's and dot the I's. And they did not necessarily align initially. So
that's exactly right. And I think you raised a great point, Andy. For companies that are not regularly exporting or do not have a robust export compliance program, a great takeaway here is determining an ECCN for your item is not simply finding the first listing for helmets, in this case, in the commerce control list under the export administration regulations and saying, oh, that's my ECCN, right? Determining an ECCN, even for seemingly a simple product, is typically never simple and requires diligence and time and care. And in this case, for helmets, you also have helmets that are, if they have certain protective levels, are also categorized under the ITAR, right? So in the case of these helmets, you have two possible classifications under the EAR, under the commerce side, as well as a possible classification under the United States munitions list, under Department of State rules. So typically, classification is never a straightforward matter. You're deciding between several ECCNs. And to your point, the civil penalties that attach to a single export violation of this nature are just south of $400,000 or twice the value of the transaction, whichever is greater, right? So if you are a company that engages in I use the word pattern of export violations, as soon as you have 4, 5, 10, 20 or more violations, right, the millions of dollars in potential civil penalties really starts to stack up. And the whole purpose of filing a VSD, I should say, while I can, is that you get 50% mitigation credit on those civil penalties and potentially full mitigation if the facts are good, such as a first violation, which it was in the case of our client that I gave the example from, and good facts like trying to do the export correctly, getting an export license, exporting pursuant to a government contract, no evidence of improper behavior or trying to conceal the true nature of the export. So it's always good to file a VSD if there are a significant number of violations and significant exposure, and especially the kind of posture here where the government's poised to initiate an investigation of their own because they've detained the goods already.
Yeah, but if you come across an error, don't ever just on your own do that. You seek out, if you're at a point where you believe there's some violations, seek out a customs attorney firm that is in the customs law, international trade law, because to advise you what's the best way to do it. Because sometimes you can do just administrative corrections. You can do, the voluntary disclosure is another thing that's a big one there, and who knows, a few other things. So,
yes.
All right, let's move on to the other story you've got. You've got another one that's doing business with Russia.
Yes. I have another story related to doing business in Russia, and I think this is becoming less of an important issue considering the vast number of companies have now come to understand the rules on Russia now that we're a few years out of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But this was a great case that originated in 2022 and 2023. The invasion took place in February, and the dynamic nature of in this case, I want to focus on Commerce Department rules, but of course also Treasury Department rules on Russia. The rules were changing sometimes weekly, but no less than monthly, it seemed, in 2022. And what emerged for Russia was that, and this is the only country in the export control laws that are this way, is that there were outbound controls for items to Russia purely based on their HTS code, right? So typically the HTS code, the harmonized tariff schedule of the United States code, is a code used by importers to determine import duties when they're bringing product into the United States. However, Commerce adopted a novel approach to capture EAR 99 items, which are subject to the lowest level of export controls traditionally in the U.S. export control laws. To capture those items for export to Russia, the Department of Commerce said, we're going to institute a supplement of HTS codes in Part 746 of the EAR that says, if you have an EAR 99 product that's being exported to Russia and it falls under one of these HTS codes, it requires an export license from the Department of Commerce, the same way those helmets from the first example required an export license from Commerce to Africa. However, in this case, many companies in 2022 were not aware of these HTS code specific restrictions. So the second example is a client that was exporting EAR 99 items to Russia throughout 2022 and 2023 even, after these rules were passed. And these were EAR 99 items, but again, controlled for export to Russia based on HTS code. And this client actually happened to receive an OFAC subpoena related to their transactions in Russia. And in order to respond to the OFAC subpoena, this actually goes back to the VSD issue we talked about earlier. We had to do a Commerce Department or export review before we could fulsomely respond to the OFAC subpoena to make sure the client also did not have commerce issues. Because if, as part of the OFAC subpoena response, there were commerce disclosures contained therein, which there would have been because the government was asking for all the client's sales information related to Russia using the freight forwarders that OFAC was interested in. So this client was using freight forwarders that OFAC was in the future going to list on the SDN list, and they were performing an investigation, and this client was using these freight forwarders that were going to go on the SDN list to sell into Russia. So this was a very messy situation for a host of reasons. However, the forwarders were not SDN listed at the time that the client was using them. So again, to make a long story short, this client received an OFAC subpoena. They had to do a full commerce review using our help before we responded to the OFAC subpoena. We discovered around 20 violations of EAR 99 items going to Russia that were controlled based on HTS code. The client had no idea about the HTS code specific restrictions. Again, with a civil penalty just under $400,000 for each of the 20 shipments. And so this client also had to do a voluntary self-disclosure to the Department of Commerce and get the initial in before the OFAC subpoena response. And luckily, the client did not have any OFAC-specific violations as part of its response there, because there would not have been the ability to file an OFAC VSD, given the client had already received a subpoena, meaning there had already been an investigation initiated for OFAC purposes. So this worked out quite nicely for the client to only have commerce issues because the VSD route was still open with respect to commerce, where it had been closed already with respect to OFAC. So this was a great case for a multitude of reasons. One, when an exporter receives a subpoena from one government agency, in order to respond to that subpoena, you have to confirm there's no possible exposure under other related agency rules. Otherwise, if you respond to that subpoena, you're no longer able to submit a VSD to that other agency, and OFAC, in this case, may communicate to that other agency and raise the violations contained in the response to OFAC for investigation and potential prosecution by the other agency. I hope that made sense. And also, for exporters to be aware of the constantly changing nature of the rules that apply to their business, whether in this client's case for sales to Russia, or in a more common case now for sales to China or other countries that are not subject to as many restrictions as Russia, to make sure that you're on top of the changing nature of these rules, to make sure that what was a compliant export yesterday is a compliant export tomorrow, because that situation can very easily present for any countries as it did for Russia, depending on the nature of the national security situation.
Well, and so in looking at this, here's one of the things is like doing business with Russia at the time. I mean, people were doing that, and trying to export into your goods out of the U.S. into Russia is very complex and difficult, and that's why a lot of people use the freight forwarders and all that. It's almost like a racket over there. However, the people you're dealing with, this is why it's important to vet not only your client, but the service providers that you're using and some of those people, and see if there's red flags that are coming up, because you don't want to be tagged and say, you're doing business with somebody that's a bad character. That's one thing that I hear. But taking it more to, things have kind of calmed down on Russia because people understand what's going on and the impact of that. But let's look at, the most current situation. You were asking about maybe what yesterday was not necessarily a deal, but today could be, is your same products. It's fine to have, there's a phenomenal market for businesses in international trade in different countries. You just got to make sure that coming back, what is it that I need to do? And you've got to get your appropriate experts and look at things. And when you're in the planning process, there may be a sale going and all that. Do the due diligence to have things checked out by appropriate people that can dig into in that deep dive, as you mentioned earlier, and make sure that you're covered, right?
Exactly, 100%. And even for companies that may not be purposefully doing business with or in Russia, more sort of relevant example for your listeners may be the issue of transshipment, which also presented in this client example. You may have a company may have what it believes is a customer in one country, but if an intermediate point for that shipment is Hong Kong, for example, or the United Arab Emirates is another high risk example, there are certain intermediate destinations that are very risky transshipment or diversion points where bad actors that companies may not be aware are involved in the transaction chain may divert the goods from Hong Kong or the UAE to Russia, unbeknownst to the exporter. And that goes to your point, Andy, of having trusted and known diligenced relationships with your intermediaries, including freight forwarders and any other parties that may take custody of the goods, especially where the customer for a company is a distributor. For example, a distributor in Hong Kong or a distributor in the UAE. Any transaction involving a distributor has to have an elevated level of review, given the potential for transfer from a distributor to a prohibited destination like Russia, Iran, from Hong Kong or the UAE. So, these issues have different sort of permutations that you have to look for, and diversion and transshipment is a big issue. In this case, in that client example, Germany was used as an intermediary point. Many folks would say, if I'm shipping to a distributor in Germany, I'm safe. Germany is a close ally. The distributor there is not likely violating any rules, but that's not always the case, even for countries in Europe. So just to the point of diligence, reviewing for red flags, a lot of times it's impossible to catch all these items, but they have to be reviewed, at least, right? An attempt has to be a good faith and sort of diligent attempt has to be made at reviewing these items. And if the risk is too high, then a decision might have to be made not to go forward with the export. But absolutely, Andy, that's right.
Josh, we're out of time here. I would love to get into some more of these kind of examples. So maybe we can have you come back and give some good, stories here so people can identify with. Remember, folks, if you've got a question, if you're doing business in the Middle East and with China, with Russia, Ukraine now, Colombia, Venezuela, we're talking about, or whatever, do your due diligence, get you some experts involved and have things checked out, because you may find out it's a great business deal. It may be too good to be true, and it'll cost you more in the long run. Josh,
right.
Thank you so much for being with us. And Lalo, I guess we need to wrap things up, don't we?
Yeah, no problem. So yeah, Josh, we do need to get you back and just expand on a bunch of other different things. Exports, we've had quite a few listeners ask me for more content on exports, and we normally concentrate a lot on imports for obvious reasons with all the tariffs and everything. But
of course,
we do need to hit up on the exports as well, because that is actually a big part of making companies grow here in the United States because of their exports. So, but yeah, we'll definitely get you back on.
Absolutely. Well, I can't thank you and Andy enough for having me, and I appreciate your listeners for taking the time to listen, and I look forward to coming back on a future show.
Folks, have a great day.
Have a good one.